I want to tell you about a Tuesday morning in October. I was sitting in a corner booth at a coffee shop I'd never been to before, one of those places with exposed brick and overpriced oat milk lattes, and I was reading over the final draft of a project proposal that would, 3 weeks later, land me the biggest contract of my career. My phone was face down on the table, my posture was easy, my hands were still. And then the door opened. I looked up, the way you look up when the air in a room changes, and there he was, Marcus, standing in the doorway in a jacket I recognized, looking older than I remembered, scanning the room with that familiar, restless energy I used to mistake for confidence. He saw me before I could look away. And here is the thing I need you to understand. I didn't freeze. I didn't feel my stomach drop. I didn't rehearse something clever to say. I just looked at him, calmly, the way you look at a place you used to live, familiar but no longer yours. He smiled first, that careful, uncertain smile of a person who isn't sure what they're walking into. I smiled back, warm, easy, real. And then I looked back down at my work. That moment, that ordinary, undramatic Tuesday morning moment, was everything I had spent 3 years building toward. Not the confrontation, not the speech, not the perfectly timed revelation of everything I had become, just the stillness, just the fact that I had nothing to prove to him anymore. Because here's the truth, the most devastating thing I ever did to Marcus was not argue back. It was not call him out in front of people. It was not show up to his life and make a scene. The most devastating thing I ever did was leave quietly and become someone he never saw coming. I didn't scream. I didn't fight back. I just became someone they never expected. And this is how I did it. Welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Alara, and this channel is a space for people who are in the middle of something hard, or just on the other side of it, and need to be reminded that the story isn't over. This story isn't about revenge. It's about becoming. It's about what happens when the person who was supposed to love you tells you that you're too broken to be worth loving, and instead of believing them, you decide to find out exactly what you're made of. I have never told this story in full before, not like this. So stay with me, because this one goes deep and it goes long, and I promise you, by the time we get to the end, you will feel something shift. If this is the kind of content that speaks to you, stories of real transformation, real pain, real proof that people can change their own lives, please hit subscribe, hit the bell, leave a comment. This community is built on people who refuse to stay small.
Now, let's go back to the beginning. I need to paint you a picture of who I was at 26, because I think a lot of you will recognize her. She was smart, genuinely, quietly smart, in the way that people who grew up in chaotic households often are. She had learned to read rooms before she could read words. She had learned to be agreeable, because agreeable meant safe. She had learned that her needs were an inconvenience, that her feelings were a burden, and that love was something you had to earn through constant, exhausting performance. I, had a degree in communications that I was doing almost nothing with. I was working as an administrative coordinator at a mid-sized logistics company in Cleveland, Ohio. It was a fine job. It paid the bills. It asked nothing of me creatively or intellectually, which at the time I told myself was a feature, not a bug. I had a small apartment with one window that faced a parking lot. I had a cat named Biscuit. I had a best friend named Dana who called me every Sunday. And I had a relationship, 18 months in at that point, with a man named Marcus. Here's what I thought I knew about Marcus. He was smart. He was driven. He had strong opinions about everything, and he shared them freely, which I had confused for a very long time with honesty. He was the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately became the gravitational center of it, and I, who had spent most of my life making myself smaller, found that magnetism intoxicating. What I did not understand yet was the difference between someone who is confident and someone who is simply loud. What I did not understand yet was that I had been trained over years and years of a childhood I won't fully detail here to find comfort in people who took up enormous space, because at least then I knew where I stood. At least then there was a center. At least then the chaos had a shape. Marcus gave the chaos a shape, and for a long time I called that love. The thing about this kind of relationship, and I want to be careful here because I know some of you are living inside one right now, is that it doesn't start with cruelty. It starts with attention. Marcus told me in the first 3 months that I was the most interesting person he'd ever met. He said it like a gift. I received it like a drowning person receives a rope. But attention, when it comes from someone like Marcus, is conditional. And the conditions shift, and they shift so gradually, so incrementally, that by the time you notice the ground has moved, you're standing somewhere completely different from where you started, and you don't even remember walking there. By the time we'd been together a year, I had stopped pitching ideas at work because Marcus had a habit of gently, almost kindly, explaining why my ideas were half-formed. I had stopped calling Dana as much because Marcus found her exhausting, and I was tired of the friction. I had started apologizing for being too sensitive, too much, too needy, in the middle of conversations where I hadn't done anything wrong. I had made myself very, very small. And here's the cruelest part of that smallness. I had convinced myself it was maturity.
I told myself, I'm learning to be less reactive. I'm learning to listen more. I'm learning to not make everything about my feelings. What I was actually learning was how to disappear inside a relationship and call it growth. It happened on a Friday night in February. We'd been having a conversation, one of those conversations that starts about something small, dishes or plans, I can't even remember. And somehow it had turned, the way those conversations always turned with Marcus, into an audit of my character. He wasn't yelling. That's the thing I need you to understand. He was never a yeller. He was always terrifyingly calm. He was sitting across from me at the kitchen table, and he said, I remember this almost word for word, because some things you just don't forget. He said, I love you, Alara. I do. But I think you have to be honest with yourself about the fact that you have a lot of damage, and I don't know if that damage is something that can be fixed. I don't know if anyone is going to be able to be with you long term and not be exhausted by it. I'm not sure you're built for the kind of relationship that actually lasts. He said it like he was doing me a favor, like it was the kindest, most honest thing anyone had ever said to me. And the most frightening part? In that moment, in that exact, awful, quiet moment, I almost believed him. I sat there at that kitchen table and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as a lock clicking shut. Not the kind of lock that keeps things out, the kind that keeps things in. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I think I said something like, okay, or I hear you, the automatic language of a person who has learned that disagreement is dangerous. And then I went to the bathroom, and I sat on the edge of the tub, and Biscuit came and pressed his forehead against my shin, and I thought, is he right? Am I too broken to be loved? And that question, that quiet, devastating question, was the beginning of everything, not the end, the beginning. I want to tell you about something that happened about 2 weeks after that conversation. I was at work, staring at a spreadsheet I wasn't really seeing, and Dana called in the middle of the afternoon, which she never did. I answered mostly out of surprise. She asked how I was doing. I gave the automatic answer, fine, busy, you know how it is. And there was a pause on the line, and then Dana said, Ilara, I'm going to ask you something and I need you to actually answer me. She said, Are you happy? I opened my mouth to say yes, and I couldn't.
I genuinely could not make the word come out. What came out instead, completely against my will, completely without permission, was a sound that I had been holding in my chest for so long it had started to calcify. And then I was crying at my desk in the middle of a Wednesday, quietly, with my hand over my mouth, while Dana sat on the other end of the line and just said, "I know, I know, I know." She didn't say anything else for a long time. She didn't have to. And that's when everything started to change. Dana had been seeing a therapist for 2 years at that point, someone she'd started going to after her own difficult divorce, and she gave me the number without me asking. I called on a Thursday. I had to call 3 times before I actually let it ring because I kept hanging up when I heard the voicemail greeting. On the 3rd call, I left a message. My voice was embarrassingly unsteady. Her name was Dr. Renata Osei. She had an office on the 4th floor of a building downtown with a plant that was definitely fake and a throw blanket on the couch that was definitely real. She was in her early 50s with reading glasses that she kept taking on and off, and she had the particular quality of good therapists everywhere. She never seemed surprised by anything. In our 3rd session, not the 1st, not the 2nd, but the 3rd, once I had stopped performing okayness for her, I told her about the kitchen table, about what Marcus said, about the lock clicking shut. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then she looked at me over her glasses and she asked one question. "What evidence did he give you for that conclusion?" I blinked at her. She said, "He told you that you're too broken to be loved long-term. What was the evidence he offered for that claim?" And I realized, for the first time sitting in that room, that there hadn't been any, not one specific thing, just the assertion delivered with such quiet certainty that it had never occurred to me to ask for the receipts. Dr. Osei leaned forward slightly and said something that I wrote in my journal that night and have read probably 500 times since. "Ilara, what you're describing is not a diagnosis of your brokenness. It's a description of his limitations. Someone who genuinely loves you and is genuinely committed to a future with you does not deliver a verdict about your capacity to be loved. They ask, how do we work on this together? The framing he chose tells you something very important, not about you, about him." I sat with that for a long time. He was describing his limitations, not my damage. I had never once considered that possibility. I left Marcus on a Sunday, not dramatically, not with tears and raised voices and things being thrown. I left the way I'd learned to do most things, quietly, carefully, in a way that inconvenienced anyone as little as possible. I packed 2 bags on a Saturday afternoon while he was at his friend Greg's place. I took Biscuit in his carrier. I took the plant I'd bought with my own money, and I left the key on the counter with a note that was exactly 2 sentences long. The note said, "I think you were wrong about me. I'm going to go find out." I drove to my apartment, which I still had because Marcus and I had never officially moved in together, which now seems like a grace, and I sat on the floor with Biscuit in my lap, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 18 months. Just interior space. Like a room that had been packed floor to ceiling with furniture, and someone had quietly cleared it out. And now there was all this air, this terrifying, exhilarating, echoing air. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I felt terrified and sad and very, very alone. But underneath all of that, and this is the part I need you to hear, underneath the fear and the grief, there was something else. Something that had been there the whole time, compressed under the weight of those 18 months. There was something that felt a lot like me, and I had missed her. People talk about the decision to change like it's a single moment, a lightning strike, a movie scene where the hero stands in the rain and says, "Enough." That's not how it works. The decision is not one decision. It's about 600 small decisions, made over days and weeks, many of which don't feel heroic at all, many of which feel like administrative tasks.
The first small decision was, I'm going to go to therapy every week, not just when things are bad. The second was, I'm going to tell Dana the truth about how bad things got. The third was, I'm going to make a list of things I used to love before Marcus. That third one, I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it matters. I sat at my kitchen table, a different kitchen table, with a notebook, and I wrote down things I had loved before Marcus, things I had quietly let go of without noticing. The list included running. I used to run 3 mornings a week. I had stopped because Marcus said he couldn't sleep when I left early. Reading. I used to finish 3 or 4 books a month. I had stopped because reading felt selfish, like time I wasn't giving to the relationship. Writing. I used to keep a blog. Nothing serious, just thoughts about media and culture and things I was processing, and I had shut it down 6 months into dating Marcus because he'd read one post and suggested gently that maybe I was oversharing. Cooking new things. I used to try a new recipe every Sunday. Marcus was a picky eater and found my experiments stressful. I looked at that list and I felt 2 things simultaneously: fury and grief. Fury because look at what I had given away. Look at the geography of a whole person slowly surrendered one small accommodation at a time. Grief because I had let it happen. I had cooperated with my own erasure. Dr. Osei, when I showed her the list, said, "You didn't lose yourself, you loaned yourself. The good news is you're still the creditor. You can call the loan back." I wrote that one down too. And that's when everything started to change. I want to be real with you here, because I think the storytelling around glow-ups often skips this part, or it compresses it into a montage. And the compression is a lie. The gap period is not a montage. It is slow, it is sometimes boring, it is often discouraging, and it is absolutely, completely necessary. Here is what the first 3 months looked like, specifically. Month 1, I went back to running. The first run was 17 minutes before I had to stop, gasping on a park path, bent over my knees, deeply humbled. I had told myself I would run 30 minutes. I ran 17. I went home, drank water, and wrote in my journal, tomorrow, 18 minutes. I started therapy weekly. In those early sessions, I cried almost every time. Not the elegant, movie-style single-tear crying, the ugly kind. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and old and has very little to do with what's happening in the room right now. I told my mom what had happened, an abbreviated version, because my relationship with my mother is its own complicated story, and she said, with the particular exhausted love of a woman who had her own battles, "You'll be fine. You're tougher than you think." It was not exactly the response I wanted. It was, I realized later, the response she knew how to give. I cried on Dana's couch twice. She made tea both times and didn't try to fix anything. That was the right call. Month 2, I started the blog again. New name, fresh start. I told myself I wasn't going to promote it or worry about who read it. I was just going to write. The first post was 1,700 words on what it felt like to start running again, and it was messy and earnest and very much not optimized for engagement. 43 people read it. 2 of them left comments that made me cry, again, not elegantly, because they said some version of, "I needed to read this today." 43 people. That might sound small, but something about those 43 people, the fact that something I had made had mattered to even a small number of real humans, cracked something open in me. Month 3. I enrolled in an online course in content strategy and digital communications, a professional development thing I had been bookmarking for 2 years and never pulling the trigger on. It was 8 weeks, self-paced, $297. I had told myself for 2 years I couldn't afford it. I had, in fact, just not prioritized it. I finished it in 6 weeks. I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying it because the speed of it surprised me. because somewhere along the way I had absorbed the message that I wasn't particularly smart or disciplined or capable, and the course was the first evidence I'd produced that contradicted that message. Evidence matters. You can't argue yourself out of low self-belief. You have to behave your way out of it.
I want to make sure I'm not giving you a highlight reel here because that's not useful to you. There was a night in month 2 when I was sitting on my bathroom floor again. Different bathroom, same floor, and I had just gotten off the phone with Marcus, who had called to check in. The call had lasted 40 minutes, and by the end of it, I had somehow agreed that maybe I had been too sensitive. Maybe I had made things harder than they needed to be. Maybe there was something to what he'd said about the damage. I hung up the phone and I just sat there. And here's what I want you to understand about that night. It wasn't a failure. It was information. It was proof of something Dr. Osai had told me, which was healing is not linear, and the people who hurt us often have maintained access to our nervous systems long after we've left the relationship. His voice, his calm, certain, this is just honesty voice, was still an authority figure inside my head. The work wasn't just leaving, the work was evicting him from the inside. That night, I texted Dr. Osai. She allowed texts for genuine crises, and I counted this as one. And I said, I talked to Marcus, and I feel like I'm back at 0. She wrote back in about 4 minutes, you're not at 0. You're at the place that always exists between growth and the old pattern. This is where the work actually happens. Rest tonight, we'll talk Thursday. I read that text 7 times. I went to sleep. I did not call Marcus back. That was not nothing. By month 4, I had begun to understand something that sounds simple but had not been simple to me. I needed people. I had spent a long time, long before Marcus, if I'm being honest, operating in a kind of proud isolation. The isolation felt like self-sufficiency. It was actually loneliness wearing a disguise. I rejoined a book club I'd left 2 years earlier. The first meeting back, I sat quietly and mostly listened. By the third meeting, I was arguing passionately about a novel's ending, and someone across the table laughed at something I said. Genuinely, delightedly laughed, and I felt something warm move through my chest. I started attending a yoga class on Saturday mornings, not because I love yoga particularly, I'm still ambivalent about yoga to be honest, but because I needed the discipline of a recurring bodily thing that had nothing to do with work or healing or progress, just breath, just gravity, just the small animal fact of having a body that moved and stretched and was, miraculously, fine. I started calling my old college friend Simone, who lived in Portland, and whom I had been terrible at staying in touch with. The first call was a little awkward, the second wasn't. By the third, we were talking for 2 hours at a stretch about work and life and what we wanted our futures to look like. These were not dramatic gestures, they were the construction of a scaffolding. And I want to tell you something about scaffolding. You don't see it in the final building, but without it, the building doesn't go up.
Here is something no one tells you about transformation. The first signs are invisible to everyone but you. By month 6, I had run a 5K. Not fast, but complete. I had published 22 blog posts with a total readership of around 3,400 unique visitors. I had completed the content strategy course and started applying the skills at work, quietly. I had read 19 books, and I had not spoken to Marcus in 61 days. None of that was visible on my face when I walked into the office, but it was visible somewhere. It was visible in the fact that I started pitching ideas in meetings again. The first time I did it, 4 months after I left Marcus, my voice actually shook slightly. I was pitching a new internal communications framework to my department, something I had put together over 3 evenings with care and genuine enthusiasm. My manager, a patient and perceptive woman named Cheryl, looked at me with an expression I couldn't read while I talked. When she finished, she was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "Ilara, where has this been? This is excellent work." That sentence, I'm going to be transparent with you, I went to the bathroom after that meeting and had a very private, very real moment that involved some tears and some deep breathing and Biscuit's face on my phone's lock screen for emotional support. Where has this been? It had been right there the whole time. I had just been giving it to the wrong audience. By month 8, the blog was doing something I hadn't expected. It was finding people. I had written a post, one I'd almost not published because it felt too raw, about what I now recognize as emotional invalidation in relationships. I didn't use that language. I just described what it had felt like in the specific sensory way I tend to write when I forget to be careful. It got shared, and then shared again, and then someone with a larger platform shared it, and within a week, that single post had been read by over 40,000 people. 40,000! I sat with my laptop open at my kitchen table watching the number climb, and I felt something I am going to call, for lack of a better word, recognition. Not fame, not validation in the social media sense, something quieter and more significant than that. The feeling that the thing I'd gone through had meaning, that the words I'd found for it were useful to other people who were looking for the same words. Marcus had told me I was oversharing. 40,000 people told me something different. I chose to believe the 40,000. I want to tell you about month 10 specifically, because month 10 was the month everything clicked from internal to external. I had been doing the blog seriously for 8 months. I had been applying my communications and content skills with increasing confidence at work. Cheryl had given me 2 incremental projects with more responsibility, both of which I had delivered ahead of schedule. In month 10, a small digital marketing consultancy reached out through my blog. They had been reading for a few months. They had a part-time content director role, remote, on a contract basis. Would I be interested in a conversation? I stared at that email for a long time. The old Alara, the one who had sat at the kitchen table while Marcus audited her character, would have talked herself out of it before she even replied. She would have thought, I'm not qualified. They're going to realize I don't know what I'm doing. This is a mistake. The new Alara, who had run 62 days in a row, who had published 35 blog posts, who had been told by her manager that her work was excellent, that Alara replied to the email within 4 hours. I got the contract. It was 20 hours a month to start. It paid more per hour than my full-time job. Pause. I want to be specific about the money because I think we sometimes sanitize transformation narratives and pretend they're purely emotional, and I don't think that's honest or helpful. Financial independence, the concrete, material ability to take up space in your own life, was a critical piece of my healing. It's not the whole story, but it is part of the story. I started rebuilding my savings. I started contributing to my retirement account for the first time. Small amounts, but real amounts. Amounts that said, I am planning a future. I believe I have a future worth planning for. And that's when everything started to change. Here is the clean, English-only version of your script, with all the timestamps, section headers, and music cues removed so you can record smoothly. I've kept the pause markers to help guide your pacing. I want to be specific about the money because I think we sometimes sanitize transformation narratives and pretend they're purely emotional, and I don't think that's honest or helpful. Financial independence, the concrete, material ability to take up space in your own life, was a critical piece of my healing. It's not the whole story, but it is part of the story. I started rebuilding my savings. I started contributing to my retirement account for the first time. Small amounts, but real amounts. Amounts that said, I am planning a future. I believe I have a future worth planning for. And that's when everything started to change. Here is the clean, English-only version of your script, with all the timestamps, section headers, and music cues removed so you can record smoothly. I've kept the pause markers to help guide your pacing. Here is the transformation that happened inside me, the one that doesn't show up in word counts or contract values or running times. About a year out, I started to notice something different happening in my relationship to other people's opinions of me.
Not that I stopped caring entirely. I think anyone who claims they've fully transcended caring what others think is either lying or missing some essential part of being human. But the weight of it changed. I remember a specific conversation with a colleague, a man named Trevor, who had a habit of slightly dismissing other people's contributions in meetings, always with a joke, always with plausible deniability, who made a comment about a presentation I'd given. He said something to the effect of, "You really committed to that, huh?" in a tone that made the commitment sound slightly embarrassing. The old me would have replayed that comment for 3 days, would have dissected it, questioned the presentation, wondered what he really meant. The new me, and I say new knowing that she's actually just the original, returned, heard the comment, felt a brief flicker of irritation, and then thought, that is about him. That is entirely about him, and moved on.
Dr. Osei had a phrase she used that I have thought about almost every day since. Other people's opinions of you are information about them. They are not instructions for you. Other people's opinions are information, not instructions. Marcus had given me a verdict about my capacity to be loved. I had almost followed it like a set of directions. The work of that year, the running and the writing and the therapy and the showing up for myself over and over in small ways, was the work of learning that I didn't have to. There is a particular kind of attention that comes from people who wrote you off. It is different from ordinary attention. It has a quality to it, an off note, a slight uncertainty, a recalibration happening in real time as they try to reconcile the person they're looking at with the story they told themselves about you. I started feeling that attention around month 14. My mother, visiting for Thanksgiving, watched me move around my apartment, which was now genuinely and intentionally organized and filled with things I loved, not the apologetic, half-abandoned space it had been 18 months earlier, and said, "You seem different." She didn't say it as a compliment, exactly. It was more like an observation, like she was taking a reading. I said, "Yeah, I think I am." And she looked at me for a long moment, and then she said something that I don't think she'd planned to say. "Good." A former colleague, someone I'd been friendly with, who had watched me be quiet and diminished at work for years, came to me specifically to ask for input on a project, not as a formality, as a genuine first choice. The blog had a small but real following. People were writing to me not as strangers looking for content, but as people looking for a person. "I've been reading for 8 months," someone wrote. "I just left a relationship where I was told I was too much. Your words were the ones I kept coming back to. Thank you." I read that email in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store, and I sat there for 5 minutes. This was what Marcus had said was too much. This specificity, this willingness to feel things and say them clearly was what he'd called oversharing. This was also what was helping people, real people, in real pain. The two facts sat next to each other in my chest, and I just let them. And that's when everything started to change. Let me tell you who I was in the October when Marcus walked through that coffee shop door. I was 18 months out of that relationship. I was 30 months into the work, the running, the therapy, the writing, and the showing up. The content director contract had expanded. I was working with 3 clients. I had left the logistics company with gratitude and no drama, on excellent terms with Cheryl, who wrote me a reference letter that made me cry again. And I was running my own small consulting practice. The blog had become a legitimate thing, not huge, but real, around 22,000 monthly readers, partnership conversations with 2 brands whose values I actually believed in, an invitation to speak at a small women's professional development event, which I had accepted after saying yes before I could talk myself out of it. I had run a half marathon in September, 13.1 miles. I had cried at mile 11, not from pain, but from something else, from the sheer animal surprise of what this body could do when I stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. I was in therapy every other week now, rather than every week, not because the work was done. Dr. Osei is clear that the work is never fully done, but because the acute phase had resolved into something more like maintenance, more like an ongoing conversation between me and myself, with her as a trusted witness. I had a small circle of people I trusted completely: Dana, Simone, and a woman named Priya from the book club, who had become, over 18 months, one of my closest friends. I was not in a new relationship. I had dated two people briefly, carefully, and learned things about myself each time. I had learned that I could leave without catastrophizing, that there were people who didn't make me smaller, that I no longer found the loud, certain, room-filling kind of person automatically magnetic, that what I wanted now was someone who was curious, warm, willing to say, "I don't know," and "tell me more." I had not found that person yet, but I had found, perhaps more importantly, that I was not in a hurry, that I was not doing any of this in order to arrive somewhere, that I had, at some point in those 18 months, stopped treating my own life as a waiting room.
That was who I was when Marcus walked through the door. It was a Tuesday morning. I was working on the project proposal I told you about at the beginning. I looked up. He saw me. The air in the room changed. He smiled first, uncertain, recalibrating. I smiled back, warm, easy, and then I looked back down at my work. I want to tell you what happened next because I think the detail matters. He came over to my table. Of course he did. Marcus has always needed the resolution. He said my name with that specific note in his voice, a note that used to pull something in my chest like a wire. I noticed, with something close to detachment, that the wire no longer responded. He said, "Hey, wow, you look great." I said, "Thanks, how are you?" And we had a conversation, a normal, civil, unremarkable conversation, the way people who used to be important to each other sometimes manage to do. He told me about a new job. I told him briefly about the consulting work. He asked about Biscuit. I showed him a recent photo on my phone. Biscuit, now 5, deeply unbothered by the world, and he laughed. At one point, he said, "You seem really settled, like really good, like you're exactly where you're supposed to be." And I thought, yes, that's right. That's exactly right. I said, "I think I am." He looked at me for a moment, and in that moment, I am going to be as honest as I can here, I saw something in his face that I won't describe as guilt because I don't know what was happening inside him, but I saw a man looking at the evidence of a story he'd told himself about me and finding that the evidence didn't match the story. He had said I was too broken to be loved. He was looking at someone who had built, out of that verdict, something he hadn't expected. I did not say any of this. I just looked back at him, warm and easy, and I let him look. I want to be honest with you about what I did not feel in that moment, because I think the myth of the glow-up encounter is that it feels like winning. I did not feel like I had won something. I did not feel a rush of vindication. I did not feel the satisfaction of a score finally settled. What I felt was simpler than that, and more complete. I felt present. I felt like myself. I felt like the conversation was happening in front of me rather than through me, like I was no longer someone who could be reached and rearranged by the specific pitch of his certainty. I felt the way you feel in a place you used to love that no longer belongs to you, fondly neutral, familiar, unattached. We said goodbye after maybe 12 minutes. He said it was great to see me. I said it was great to see him. I meant it in the mild, uncomplicated way you mean it about someone who was once your whole world and is now just a person you used to know. He walked to the counter to order. I looked back at my work.
And here is what I thought in the 30 seconds after he walked away. I thought about the kitchen table, about the lock clicking shut, about the night I sat on the bathroom floor and wondered if he was right about me. I thought about the 17-minute run, the 43 readers, the 40,000, the 13.1 miles.
I thought about Dr. Osei saying, "His limitations, not your damage." I thought about Dana saying, "I know, I know, I know." And then I thought, I am so glad I didn't believe him. Not because I had something to prove, but because everything I had built in the not believing, every book, every morning run, every honest sentence, every hard therapy session, every small decision to show up for myself, all of that was mine. All of that was real. All of that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the question I had been asking since the beginning. Who am I actually when no one is telling me who I am? The answer turned out to be someone I really genuinely like. I want to say something here that I think is the most important thing in this entire story. The transformation was not revenge. I know the title of this video says silent revenge. I know that's what the algorithm is fed by, but if you've made it this far, I want to give you the more accurate version because you've earned it. The transformation was not for him. It was not to prove anything to him. It was not structured around the moment in the coffee shop or any moment like it. It was built on Tuesday mornings when no one was watching. It was built on runs when my legs hurt and I kept going anyway. It was built on therapy sessions where I said true things out loud that I had been keeping in the dark. It was built on the blog, on the book club, on the calls with Simone, on the slow, unglamorous daily practice of refusing to treat myself like a problem to be managed. The encounter with Marcus was not the point. The encounter was just evidence. Evidence that the real question, am I too broken to be loved, had an answer, and the answer was not the one he gave me. The answer was in the life I had built. The answer was in the people who showed up for me and the one I had become for myself. He said I was too broken to be loved. My therapist said he was the problem. My life proved it. Not to him, not for him, for me. For me. There's a saying, you know it, you've probably seen it on Instagram, that says, "The best revenge is living well." I want to offer you a small edit. The best revenge is living well, but only if you're doing it for yourself. Because if you're living well for him, you're still letting him be the center of gravity. You're still in orbit around someone who decided your value and found it lacking. You're still in some essential way performing for an audience that never deserved the show. The version of this story that ends with me walking into that coffee shop, hoping he'd be there, hoping he'd see me, hoping I'd get to watch his face, that's a story about someone who is still living inside what happened to them. The version that actually happened was different. I didn't know he'd be there. I wasn't thinking about him. I was working on a project I cared about in my own life on a Tuesday morning for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone who had once told me I was broken. That's the version I want for you.
I want to leave you with the things that actually moved the needle, because this story is not just mine. It belongs to anyone in this comment section who is 3 months into their own gap period, wondering if it's working. 1. Therapy, if you can access it, not as a crisis intervention, as a practice, as a place to take the beliefs that run you and hold them up to the light and ask, where did this come from? Is it true? Whose voice is this really? If traditional therapy isn't accessible to you right now, journaling with intention, specific questions, honest answers, no editing, is a place to start. 2. Evidence before belief. You cannot think your way to self-worth. You have to behave your way there. Find the smallest possible version of a thing you're afraid you can't do it, collect the evidence, let the evidence be the argument. 3. Rebuild your people. One relationship, however important, cannot be your entire ecosystem, and a relationship that requires you to shrink your ecosystem in order to survive is not a relationship, it's a hostage situation. Your people are out there. Some of them are in book clubs and yoga classes and on the other end of phone calls you haven't made yet. 4. Give the transformation somewhere to go. Running was not just exercise for me. The blog was not just content. They were places where the new version of me could exist and be tested and be real in the world. Find your somewhere. It doesn't have to be public or impressive. It just has to be yours. 5. And this is the most important one. Let the transformation be for you, not for the person who doubted you, not for anyone watching, not even for the future person you hope to become. Do it for the person who is sitting in the room right now, reading this, who is maybe in the middle of the gap period and wondering if it's worth it. It is worth it. I am telling you from the other side of it, it is worth it. You are not too broken to be loved. You are not too much. You are not too damaged. You are a person in the middle of a story that is not finished yet. And the most powerful thing you can do, more powerful than any confrontation, any call-out, any performance of what you've become, is to turn away from the person who doubted you and walk further into your own life. Not because you're running from them, because you have somewhere to be. That's the story. That's the full, real, uncompressed version of what happened when I stopped believing the verdict and started building the evidence. If you made it to the end of this video, first of all, thank you. Genuinely, this was a long one, and I know your time is real. I want to hear from you. What's your glow-up story? Where are you in the process? Are you still on the bathroom floor? Are you 3 months into the gap period? Or are you on the other side of something, looking back? Tell me below. I read every single comment. This community is built on those answers. If this video meant something to you, please share it with one person who needs to hear it. Not for the algorithm, though honestly, yes, also for the algorithm, but because somewhere out there is someone who is sitting at a kitchen table being told they're too broken, and they need to know that that sentence is not the end of the story. Subscribe if you haven't. The bell icon means you'll actually see new videos when they come out, which the platform, for reasons best known to itself, does not guarantee otherwise. I'll be back with another story soon. Until then, keep building. The Tuesday mornings add up. I promise.